and then I'm going to just talk a little bit about what we're doing when I start officially with Plant for the Planet in March, working on restoring tropical forests in the Yucatán Peninsula in Mexico. So I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Hawaii for the next month, and I have done restoration work in a lot of different places. So I started off working in New England in the United States, just looking at forest recovery and regeneration over time. And then I moved on and did my graduate work working in tropical dry forests in northern Costa Rica in the Guanacaste province. And then since then, I've been working in two different places, in southern Costa Rica, in kind of the highlands close to the border of Panama, and in Hawaii in the United States. And I've been working with a really long-term restoration project called the Islas Project that Zach Zahawi and Karen Hull run, where they're trying to use a different technique called applied nucleation to restore wet forests. And then in Hawaii, I've done a lot of work looking at trying to understand rare plant reintroductions. So there's tons of super endangered plant species in Hawaii, and people are doing a lot of work to kind of bring them back into the system. And I've come in and been helping with some data analysis and experiments for that project. Just to give everyone kind of an overview of how a lot of people think about restoration. Just broad definition is that it's the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem. And it can take two different approaches. And what we think about for tree planting, it's an active restoration approach. The other approach is passive. So what passive means is typically that ecosystems, and especially forests, have a tremendous capacity to just regenerate on their own. And if you remove basically these pressures, such as unnatural fires and grazing and a lot of other things that can happen, a lot of ecosystems will come back. And that's a really amazing thing, but it really depends on how the land was used and how degraded it was. So a lot of the areas that we're all thinking about for doing tree planting have been so degraded that we really need to take this active tree planting approach. But through all of my work, I really try to think about how these two different restoration approaches really intersect and how we can apply them in the best way, given the situation, the history of the land, what governments want to bring back as much of the land as we possibly can to try to offset all these carbon emissions. There's been, as everyone knows, lots of recent work, just global initiatives where people are committing to restoration. And a lot of this started with the Bond Challenge, where we had tons of countries that were committing to restore millions and millions of hectares. This worked really well to get people excited about doing restoration, specifically a lot for just forests in general. But a lot of these kind of targets didn't really meet where we needed to actually get to. So what we now have is something that Plant for the Planet is really championing the Trillion Tree program. And there's tons of really a groundswell of effort behind making this actually work. But what's really key is if we're going to be doing restoration on such an incredible scale, we need to actually connect with understanding how these ecosystems work. So that's what I spend a lot of my time thinking about. So my two really big goals that I have with my work are trying to understand the mechanisms, or really kind of what's happening behind outcomes of restoration. So why did something not work? Why did it work? And how can we make it make an outcome better based on small tweaks that we can make in our approach? And in doing so, I try to think about linking basic, so really theoretical science with applied science. So in the applied side, I'm really talking about tree planting because that's where a lot of my work has been. And I've done a lot of work using really kind of large scale experiments. So typically science experiments sometimes, not only take place in the lab, they might take place if they're outside on a really small area. So our goal is to really do this on the scale of hectares and much larger areas so we can really see how these approaches work in the field. So I use these experiments to test theories and also to develop tools to better restore and conserve landscapes. And a lot of my work has taken place in secondary forests. And for those that aren't super familiar with this term, essentially this just means a forest that is sort of passively regenerated. So there's, especially in the temperate zone where forests have kind of been recovering after land abandonment for many, many years, there's a lot of stories where forests have kind of come back just naturally. So this is a picture of a forest that's been growing for about 30 to 40 years. And you can see that there's still a lot of space in between all these plants. So passive regeneration can get us somewhere, but based on, like I said, the level of land degradation, sometimes we really need to come in and take this active approach. So we really want to think about kind of what we need to push the system or catalyze the system to regrow. And I have really shifted almost all of my work over to tropical forests. And this really happened because I went to Ecuador when I was in college, and I just got so excited about the incredible biodiversity of these systems. And then thinking more about really where all the carbon is stored. Tropical forests store more than half of the world's carbon in forests, and basically are just, because they're so hyper diverse in terms of plants and animals and insects, they're really, really important ecosystems. So this is what I've dedicated my work to, is trying to restore tropical forests in general. And another thing that's really interesting about tropical forests is that you have a lot of different types of land uses that you want to consider when you come into basically designing a restoration program. So you might have a little patch in the corner of an area where there's still some intact forest, right adjacent to some agriculture, some bananas growing, and then right next to it, you might have a big open field used for cattle grazing. So it's important to kind of consider what people call the landscape matrix, all the little pieces that fit together when you're designing a restoration program, so that you can really use things to your advantage. So like this tiny little forest patch in the corner can be a seed source that will help you, not basically after you are able to attract animals and back to the system by making some canopy closure by planting trees, then these species that are already sitting in this little corner can actually then provide some additional seeds as the forest regenerates. I've also really committed to basically working in seasonal tropical forests. And when we think about a tropical forest, a lot of people really think about a rainforest where it's really dark, there's super massive trees everywhere, and basically we have this kind of picture in our head of that is a tropical forest. But half of tropical forests are seasonal forests. And what this means is that there's a lot of trees that lose their leaves in what we call the winter. But in the winter, in a tropical dry forest, the winter is just when there's little to no rain. So there's a whole range of tropical seasonal forests, but they make up about half of all tropical forests, and they're very understudied, and they're also super endangered. So where I've worked in northwestern Costa Rica, this system basically has 90% of the trees that lose their leaves completely in the dry season. But there's a range. So the Plant for the Planet reserves in the Yucatan, about 50 to 60% of the trees lose their leaves. So it's a little bit different, but it's still a very seasonal forest. And then you have a really strong dry season that really drives the dynamics of these forests. And then the kind of last concept I want to introduce basically is that when we think about putting an ecosystem back together, we also want to think about the fact that there's different stages in ecosystem development. So we call this succession. And basically you have an early to a middle to a late stage. An early stage is just, we think of an open field, and then middle, some trees start coming back, and then later you kind of get a canopy of those trees and it closes and there's a lot of shade. And over this time period, lots of things change. And I think specifically a lot about environmental conditions that change. So you can think about a big, hot, open field. It can dry out really quickly just because there's lots of sun. But then once we get to a later successional stage, it's more humid. And basically, the conditions are a lot easier for certain plant species and animal species to handle. So basically, taking this, like the title of my talk, a holistic approach to restoration, we really want to think about all the things that are happening over time and not just that first stage where you're planting the tree, but what it is that to really build that system back, what do you have to do after that initial stage in terms of maybe bringing some additional species, planting later on, or doing some clearing to kind of make sure the trees grow faster, but how do we go along this natural successional pathway? And one of the things that we can use to really think about basically how do we rebuild an ecosystem in a natural way is something that's called functional traits. So functional trait really simply is a characteristic of a plant that shows how it uses and acquires resources like sun or water or nutrients. And there's really a massive range of what people call traits. But as you can see from these pictures of a lot of the species that I work with in Costa Rica, there's a huge range of strategies that trees have to grow and live. So just for example, you can see that all of these leaves have really different sizes. And the size of a leaf can be a really nice characteristic to think about when we think about light capture, so how much light a leaf can actually grab. Along these kind of gradients, like successional gradients and basically different trajectories that happen when a forest regenerates, you can think about what are the best species characteristics to use when you want to start a system based on what the initial conditions are. So that's where I spent a lot of my graduate work, was thinking about how to use plant characteristics to design the best species mixes for restoration projects. I'm just going to tell a couple stories about some projects that we did in Costa Rica. And one of the big ones was trying to determine what restoration approaches or management practices we could use and what functional traits of plants were best to improve tree establishment on soils that were really degraded. For these two projects, all of this work was done in collaboration with Estación Experimental Forestal Horizontes. And I worked really closely with three people. One is Pedro Alvarado, who's on the left here, who's a restoration ecologist at the site. And then my advisor, Jennifer Powers, is in the center. She's a soil biogeochemist and professor at the University of Minnesota. And then Milena Gutierrez is the director of the station on the right. These are the three core people that I worked with the most. And then we had a really incredible group of volunteers and other students that I worked alongside for about 5 years. So this work was all done on a really degraded soil that we were trying to get to recover. So this soil is called a vertisol. And what makes it really interesting is that it has this high content of expansive clay. And what this means, though, is it's a very stressful system. So I'll talk you through a little bit how this works. But just to start, this is a picture of 30 to 40 years of forest regrowth just naturally. And there's only 2 species that you can really see in this picture. Everything is very sparse. And basically all this was deforested to flood for growing rice. And then there was some cattle grazing after. But the forest recovery is really, really, really slow. So this is an example where passive regeneration wouldn't really be really good. And this is where we'd really want to do some active management like tree planting. This soil is also particularly stressful because in the dry season, because of this clay, it cracks. And then in the wet season, it floods. So you have this really super stressful system that plants have to deal with. So we were trying to target the best plants to grow here to basically restore it as fast as possible. I'm not going to show tons of figures, but this is just my first one just to give a general overview of why we want to think about the importance of soil. So we find over a really large landscape that soil chemistry has a really large influence on where trees occur or the distribution of trees in this system. So really quickly on the vertical axis here, I'm showing three different predictors, which are just what we are using to understand the distribution of tree species. So soil texture, the age of the forest, stand age, and soil chemistry. And then in the bottom axis, this is just basically the strength of the relationship between these predictors and tree occurrence. And the highest one we have here is soil chemistry. So trees are really tied very tightly to what soil type they are living on. So it's really important to consider the actual soil type when we're doing a restoration, because certain tree species don't really grow there at all, and certain species do, they dominate. So this is why we focused a lot on understanding the best species for this particular place, this vertisol soil. So what we did was we did a really large scale planting trial with 32 native tropical dry forest tree species. And we planted 10 seedlings of each species for a total of 1,700 seedlings. We also tried some soil amendments. So we were trying to increase drainage and basically help these plants along. And we found that the soil amendments that we used were not particularly helpful to increase survival and growth. And it really was the species that mattered the most. So I'm going to talk about the species, which are all these different colors of dots in here. And what we did to get an idea of these species strategies was to measure a ton of functional traits. So this is a lot of information here, but basically this is just to demonstrate that there are a lot of different characteristics of plants that we can use to understand how they use and acquire resources. So we can measure leaf traits, we can measure how, where plants put their biomass into leaves and roots and stems. And then we also focused a lot on measuring ecophysiology traits. So what this means is basically photosynthesis rates and how a plant deals with drought stress, and then some leaf chemistry traits. And then with a really excellent group of volunteers, we were able to actually plant this pretty quickly. Now that I see how rapidly Plant for the Planet plants, I'm not as impressed that we planted this in 2 weeks, but we did plant it in 2 weeks, and it was a ton of work, but really fun. What we found really initially was just dramatic range of species survival. So here I'm showing just the percent of all these seedlings that survived on the vertical axis, and then all the species on the horizontal. So on the left-hand side, you can see that there are a lot of species that didn't survive at all. So these are obviously not adapted to the soil type. But on the right-hand side, we had quite a few that did really well. So we were able to identify some what we call restoration viable species that we're going to use for future trials. So then the cool thing was trying to understand what it is about these species that did really well that really shows why they did well. And that's where we can use the traits. Everything that I have highlighted in blue here is what was basically the most predictive or correlated the best with species survival and growth. And what we really found was that it was these traits that were related to water use and photosynthesis that predicted a species survival. And this makes a lot of sense because this is a drought stress system. You have half of the year with little to no rain. And basically it's the ability of these species, these tree species, to survive drought that is the most important thing to think about in our system. And these traits, because they're a little bit harder to measure, are typically ignored. And that's why a lot of people haven't looked at them. But we basically now have shown in this work and additional work that we really, when we're doing tree planting efforts, we need to think about how to define basically how well these trees deal with these stressful situations, because if we don't do that, then we'll have, we can have some pretty big project failure just by planting the wrong species. So for this system, we were able to develop a really nice list of species that were good for doing this. But for future systems, if we have just a general idea of basically what level these species have of these drought stress traits, then we can actually probably get a good picture of how to do this on a really, really large scale. And that's what we'll be trying in the upcoming years at the Plant for the Planet plantings in Mexico. We really found through this that it's really hard to restore on this soil type, but it's possible. And we found some candidate species that were really good for this. And functional traits or plant characteristics really helped us to design these mixes and pick the right tree species. And then, like I said, we really want to think about water use and drought stress traits when designing species mixes in seasonal forests. And these are half of all tropical forests. It's a massive land mass. So this is a really helpful way to try to pick the right species. So then after we did this trial, which was relatively small, it was about ½ hectare, we wanted to really scale this up and do this on a much larger scale. So we tried to group species into resource use strategies, which I'll talk about a little bit more, and then look at how those strategies work for a species over different successional stages. So we can kind of think about species as having two different basic main groups, which we call acquisitive versus conservative. And basically what this means is that some plants grow really fast, which we put in this acquisitive group. Because of that, they need a lot of resources because they're burning through things as they grow. They maximize their resource capture to actually meet that, but there's a trade-off. So because of that, they're usually not as tolerant of stress. On the other hand, you have conservative species that are these slower growing species. They can tolerate not having as much resources, and that because of that, they're really efficient in how they use them. But because they grow slower, but they are also much more drought and stress tolerant. So we've tried to use these two main groups basically to take a bunch of different traits and then basically assign species into different groups to see if this helped us to understand basically how plants survived and grow at different successional stages. So a big open field versus an area where there is some existing canopy cover and there's a little bit more moisture in the soil and things like that. So our idea was that the conservative species would have higher survival in really early successional stages because they can tolerate that stressful environment. And then acquisitive species, the faster growing ones, would have higher survival in the later stages just because they're not as stress tolerant. And again, we did this on this really degraded soil type, the vertisol, trying to understand how to restore it the best. This is on a larger scale. It's a full 6 hectares. So this is an aerial image of the plots. And basically what we did was we had a cleared and interplanted treatment. So the cleared are the yellow boxes. And this is where we came in and removed existing vegetation to simulate this really early successional stage. And each one is a hectare. And then interplanted is where we actually planted or did what's called enrichment planting into the existing vegetation. And that's our later successional stage. So a cleared can be thought about just as an open area where you had cattle grazing, which is about approximately half of the land that Plant for the Planet has in Mexico. And then the other interplanted treatment is where there is some existing vegetation and again, can be matched really nice with the Plant for the Planet work, where they're doing a lot of enrichment planting into existing forest. And then we planted out these species mixes of acquisitive and conservative groupings that we made, basically to then test how they did at different successional stages. And we did this in a standard 4x4 meter spacing between all the seedlings, and then I had about 3,400 seedlings total through everything. So then basically what we did was some statistics to try to say, okay, what was it that helped us to understand the survival and growth of individual plants? So we took all of these different traits and we took the acquisitive and conservative strategies and then did some model selection. So basically just building and trying to understand the best model that can predict how these seedlings did. And then tried to see if the individual traits, so for example, photosynthesis rate was better predictor or a worse predictor of the plant growth or survival, or if we could just use these acquisitive versus conservative groupings. What we again found, and I kind of alluded to this before, was that it was photosynthesis and water use that was really important for understanding whether or not a plant did well. And unfortunately, we weren't able to use these acquisitive conservative groupings as nicely as we want it to, but that's okay because we still have a really nice list of traits that do the best. These are just the rankings of the best models, so the best predictor for survival and growth. And you can see that up top, we have this trait, which is AMAX, that's just photosynthesis, and that's the best predictor of tree survival. And water use efficiency is also a top predictor of that. And then in growth, we have some other predictors, but there's still also these physiological predictors. Delta 13C is a leaf isotope, basically just shows water use efficiency of a plant over time. And then stomatal conductance is just how much basically carbon a plant is able to take out. So if these plants were able to basically tolerate the stressful environment, it was really the traits, the photosynthesis and water use traits, again, that were the most predictive of that. Unfortunately, we couldn't use these just binary bins of acquisitive conservative. And really it was basically these drought stress traits that were the best to predict outcomes and also just the best to design species mixes. And this is really, again, super helpful because it matches really well with the successional theory of a dry forest in general, or a seasonal forest. So it helps us to understand more just the successional dynamics of these forests, but it's also helped us to develop these restoration best practices. And this is why I really love doing restoration experiments, because you're not only restoring a full 6 hectares of forest, you're also at the same time understanding the theory behind the science better. And then in the end, you can get a better idea of how to do the restoration over time. That was basically just my general overview of kind of what I've been working on coming into this. And with that, I want to just thank a lot of people, especially the Powers Lab at the University of Minnesota, Horizontes, the experimental forest that I worked with, and then my postdoc advisors for just talks about this stuff. And then funding sources from the National Science Foundation of the United States, Garden Club of America, and then a lot of stuff from the University of Minnesota. So then with that, I'm super excited to talk about some of the work that we're starting to plan at Plant for the Planet in Mexico. And I'll be starting as the Director of Science on March 1st. Just to take you now to Mexico, Plant for the Planet, the new Centro de Investigaciones, which is very new within the past couple months, essentially, now developing a team, is down here in the Yucatán Peninsula. So it's in the southern Yucatan in the Campeche province, and it's in a seasonal forest. It is actually not wetter than where I worked before. It's still 1.5 meters of rain a year, but there's more rain kind of continuously through the year. So because of that, you have a lot more kind of evergreen species in this region. Plant for the Planet has over 20,000 hectares of land that they've been working on since 2015. In these areas, there is a whole range of basically different forest types and different land uses, like I talked about. A lot of it is very degraded, and it's pasture, basically abandoned after cattle grazing. But then there's a lot of areas that are forests that are pretty preserved, although we're doing some work on actually understanding how preserved they are. And then basically there's a bunch of areas that have had kind of selective logging where trees have been pulled out. So Plant for the Planet is doing enrichment planting to bring back some of those species that have been lost. In total, Plant for the Planet has planted almost 7 million trees across these 20,000 hectares. And there's different areas. So there's the kind of core reforestation areas. Part of this forest is was a separate donation to start, called the Plan B forest. And then really recently, there's a research forest that is really close to the main Centro de Investigación. This is the research forest Plan B. We're really focusing on 3 main core things that we're going to start and have already actually started shifting towards for Plant for the Planet work in Mexico. So one is just increasing the biodiversity of the species that we're planting into this system, and really aim towards restoring as much ecosystem function like those functional traits and bringing back all those characteristics of plants that we can possibly bring. Number two, we're basically working on expanding the long-term monitoring program, looking at what worked and what didn't for all the outplantings, and just kind of really nicely basically measuring plant survival and growth over a larger area, and also working on integrating new technology into that. Third, building more collaborations with local government organizations to really start to make an even broader impact in this region, just based on working with other people that are doing restoration. So I want to mention the two main people that are working down in Mexico right now with Felix. Dinosca Rondon, who is our field manager. She's coordinating all the field work and all the data collection. And Dr. Ana Carbonell, who is our new director of the field station. And she really is overseeing everything and making sure that all these new changes are put into place, and that we really get the best outcomes out of all the tree planting that we're doing. Both Dino and Ana have an excellent training in plant ecology and have done a lot of work just trying to understand plant biology in general. So to start, we are going to basically focus a lot on planting out more diverse species mixes. And Plant for the Planet, a lot of areas just start with a blank slate. So about half of the land is a pasture, and there's tree species kind of scattered around, but maybe just a couple tree species here and there. Since 2015, what Plant for the Planet has been doing is planting a core group of about 8 species that are really common to the region. And this helps to really jumpstart the forest regrowth. And what we're really going to be doing is trying to add back in additional functions. So we start with 8. At this point, we're going to aim this year specifically to get to over 20. And then we're hopefully going to get up to over 30 over time. So basically, what's really important is that we're really adding back the pieces of this ecosystem so that we eventually get up to a kind of a full function capacity. And no one can ever really match exactly, bring back an ecosystem to exactly where it was before. It's better to try to conserve those really intact systems. But we can try, and we can really add back as much biodiversity and function as we possibly can. And what this actually ends up doing is there's really great studies that show that the more biodiversity you have in your system, in a forest in terms of trees, the more carbon you capture. So the more we'll actually offset of human emissions and basically take ourselves in the right direction. So we're going to spend a lot of time, and we're already building basically a new seed collection program that we're going to use to grow out much more species than the ones that are already being grown out in the nursery. And there's just incredible capacity to grow so many different seedlings. We just need to shift that into a little bit more diverse mix. So the next part is really working on expanding our monitoring program. So just looking at how all of our seedlings and tree plantings are doing in the field. And there's just such an incredible crew of people that have already been working on this. The reforesters that put all the trees into the ground, then do all the maintenance, and then do all the monitoring themselves. So we're really going to be working to train this great group that already exists and just kind of add in some additional basically procedures when we go out doing maintenance in the field. So every single tree that gets planted out for many years basically gets nicely cleaned around it so that it doesn't have grass and other species competing with it. So we're trying to integrate into these existing procedures how best to then go and measure the survival and growth of all these planted seedlings. And there's a lot of different ways you can do this. One is just traditional field surveys, and this is what we've done a lot in the past, of going out and tagging a tree and then just making sure that we know how well it's growing over time. But I've done a lot of work using drones to actually measure restoration at a larger scale. So for example, to the top side of this image is a restoration, and you can see that there's a lot more tree cover in it. And then the lower side is the control that we used for this different project. We have a lot more ground still showing. So just from really simple drone imagery, we can actually track really quickly a large scale area and see how restoration is doing. But we're going to work a lot in collaboration with ETH Zurich and Tom Crowther's lab to try to actually identify individual tree species from these drone images as well. And I've had really good luck doing these kind of large scale drone imagery surveys just from really pretty inexpensive off the shelf drones, just taking RGB or red, green, blue camera imagery and putting things all together. So we're going to basically take this top-down approach where we have the satellite images, and then we'll have drone images, and then all of the measurements of the individual trees on the ground, and then try to see the best way to really do this large-scale monitoring and really understand how can we really get an idea of how well things are working out in the field on a much larger scale. Because in the end, Plant for the Planet is planting eventually tens of thousands of hectares of trees. We really need to see how well things are going. And there's been really, really excellent luck in survival because Plant for the Planet is planting out really large seedlings and taking good care of them. We just want to make sure that that continues. So we need to think of ways to really keep tracking things over time. And we're also really training a core group of people from the local community that will really be focused on data collection. So because we're kind of invested in the long-term training, we'll have groups that work really well with going out into the field and collecting data. And Anna is helping to build that core group of data collectors that we'll hopefully hold on to for a really long time. And then the last example I'm going to give is us trying to build some collaborations with local government organizations and farmers. We're working now with an organization called INIFAB, which is a Mexican government organization that focuses on agroforestry and agriculture. And they also have some forests that they focus on conserving. And last year in April, there was actually a really big fire that came into one of their forests. So we're working on building a partnership with them so that they can actually reforest this area a lot quicker than they would be able to themselves. So Plant for the Planet has the capacity to really do a lot of work really quickly because we have excellent tree planters and we have the nurseries to grow the plants. So we're working with INIFAB to develop a plan to actually do some plantings into this area that had a fire burn through and take out a lot of pretty important species. So this fire was not intentional, obviously. It was burned through accidentally. And basically, it's not a natural part of the system for fire to really be burning through like this. So INIFAB has created a plan to do the restoration here, and we're working with them to actually try to plan out, could be at least 500 hectares of land to come in and enrich and bring back some of the species that were lost because of this fire. So we're working on this plan with them, and then this will be hopefully something that we can continue on for the long term. We may do a full reforestation of this whole burned area this year, but we really want to continue to work with local organizations so that we can not only be reforesting on Plant for the Planet land, but really kind of expand out to other areas of Mexico and hopefully really build these nice links with government organizations so that the work that's done is really permanent, and trees that are planted right now will be here in hundreds of years because they're placed on these really long-term permanent reserves that are owned by the government. And we went out to check out this site. It was December, and there's really a lot of kind of trees that have fallen down, and it's going to be hard work, but we're really developed a nice plan to work with INIFAB to really bring this forest back a lot quicker than they would be able to. So basically they would they have a plan in place, and they would likely reforest over many years. So we're hopefully going to be able to really help them to jumpstart this by doing it pretty quickly. And then just super briefly, last but not least, I wanted to introduce our really important core member of our group, Moskiti, who follows us along and really helps us advise us on our decisions that we're making in the field. And hopefully you'll hear a lot more from her soon as time goes on. She came along with us on this field trip and was really, really helpful to have her there kind of figuring things out. So that's about it. And I'm just really excited to get started, really full time with Plant for the Planet. And I'm really excited to be working with this wonderful group of people. And with that, I will take any questions.